Which Hogwarts house produces the most powerful wizards? You already have an answer. You formed it before you finished reading the question, quickly, automatically, with the confidence of someone who has lived inside this universe long enough to feel certain about its hierarchies. And your answer is probably Gryffindor, or maybe Slytherin, one of those two, because those are the houses the story keeps returning to. The houses whose members fill the history books and the battle rosters, and the ministry's most consequential positions. The houses whose rivalry structures the entire narrative architecture of 7 years at Hogwarts, and a wizarding war that reshaped the world. You are going to hold that answer for the next few minutes. And by the end of this, you are going to reconsider it completely. Not because the answer is Hufflepuff, though what Hufflepuff actually produces will surprise you more than you expect. Not because the answer is Ravenclaw, though Ravenclaw's real power is more dangerous than its reputation suggests. The answer, when it arrives, is going to require redefining what powerful means. Not redefining it arbitrarily, not moving the goalpost to manufacture a surprising conclusion. Redefining it the way any serious analysis requires, by looking at what each house actually produces in the world, not what it claims to produce, not what its most famous alumni represent, not what the Sorting Hat song says about its values in the abstract. Power measured in outcomes, in survival rates during the war, in institutional influence across generations, in the specific documentable results that each house's approach to magic and to life produces in the people who spend 7 years inside it. Here is what makes this question harder than it looks. Hogwarts does not sort by magical ability. This is the foundational fact that most people skip past when they think about house power. And skipping it produces conclusions that feel right and are wrong. The hat does not measure raw magical talent. It measures disposition, the orientation of the mind, the values that drive the person, the qualities that will shape how they develop. Which means that the distribution of raw magical power across the 4 houses is, over a large enough sample, roughly equal. Every house has produced extraordinary wizards. Every house has produced mediocre ones. The talent distribution is not the variable. What differs, what the houses actually control, is what happens to that talent over 7 years. How it is developed, directed, disciplined, and deployed. What each house's culture does to the raw material it receives. What each philosophy of magic and life produces when it is applied consistently across a formative decade to a developing witch or wizard. That is what we are measuring. And that measurement produces a ranking that is not what you think. Stay with this, because the argument builds slowly with evidence, with the specific details of what each house actually creates in the world. And the conclusion only makes sense if you follow it from the beginning. Starting with the house that everyone assumes is at the top. Part 1. Gryffindor, the house that wins battles and loses wars. Gryffindor's case for most powerful is the most intuitive one and the easiest to make on the surface. Look at the names. Dumbledore, Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, McGonagall, the Weasley family across multiple generations, James Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, the founders of the Order of the Phoenix, the members of Dumbledore's army, the people who stood at the front of every significant confrontation in the wizarding world's most consequential century. Gryffindor's alumni roster reads like a catalog of the wizarding world's most important moments, which is either evidence that the house produces powerful people or evidence that the house produces people who put themselves in the most visible positions. And these are not the same thing. This distinction is the beginning of the honest analysis of Gryffindor's power. The house selects for courage, nerve, and the disposition toward action in the face of danger. What this produces, at its highest expression, is genuinely extraordinary. People capable of doing things in moments of crisis that no amount of talent without courage could produce. Harry walking into the Forbidden Forest. Neville standing in front of Voldemort with the Sorting Hat on fire. The entirety of the Battle of Hogwarts, which was won by Gryffindor-type courage more than by superior magical power or superior strategy. In the specific category of performing under existential pressure, Gryffindor is unmatched. The house trains people, through its culture, its stories, its accumulated expectation of what its members do when things become dangerous. To function when functioning is the hardest possible thing. But power is not only crisis performance. And here is where the honest examination of Gryffindor begins to complicate its own case. The house's relationship with strategy is its most significant limitation. Gryffindor's charge. This is the disposition the hat selects for. The instinct toward forward motion, toward engagement, toward the visible act of facing the thing directly. What this produces in crisis is heroism. What it produces across the longer arc of a war, a political campaign, an institutional struggle, is a pattern of winning confrontations and losing ground. The Order of the Phoenix, across both Wizarding Wars, was overwhelmingly Gryffindor in composition and culture. It was also outmaneuvered, repeatedly, by Death Eater operations that worked through infiltration, through institutional corruption, through the patient accumulation of influence in the ministry that Gryffindor's direct action orientation consistently underestimated. Voldemort's first rise was not primarily a military campaign. It was an institutional one, the systematic corruption of the ministry, the Wisengamot, the media, the social structures that govern how the wizarding world organizes itself. And the Order of the Phoenix, full of the most courageous wizards of their generation, fought it primarily as a military campaign. They won battles. They lost the ministry. They lost the Daily Prophet. They lost the courtrooms. They lost, repeatedly, the public narrative, the story of what was happening and who was responsible, to a side that understood the value of institutional influence in a way that Gryffindor's charge-first culture fundamentally did not. The magical power of Gryffindor's alumni is real. Dumbledore was the most powerful wizard of his age. Harry Potter did something that no magical theory had ever predicted. Hermione Granger is, by any academic measure, among the most technically skilled witches of her generation. But power in a complex world is not individual magical ability. It is the capacity to translate individual ability into durable outcomes, to build things that outlast the moment of crisis, to accumulate influence that operates when you are not personally present, to understand that the war is not only the battle. Gryffindor produces people who are extraordinary in the battle. It produces fewer people who are extraordinary in everything that surrounds a battle. And everything that surrounds the battle is where wars are actually won. Part 2. Slytherin, the house that builds a system and gets trapped inside it. Slytherin's case is the mirror image of Gryffindor's, where Gryffindor wins the visible confrontation and loses the institutional game. Slytherin is extraordinary at the institutional game and repeatedly, catastrophically, loses the visible confrontation. The house that produced more ministers for magic than any other in recorded wizarding history, that understood the architecture of power before any of the other houses, that has been playing the long game since Salazar himself, also produced Voldemort, also produced the Death Eater movement, also produced, in its worst iterations, the most complete example in wizarding history of a house's philosophy consuming itself. This contradiction is not incidental to understanding Slytherin's power. It is the center of it. The hat selects for ambition, cunning, and resourcefulness, for the disposition to identify what you want and construct the most efficient path to it. What this produces, at its highest expression, is genuine strategic genius. Slytherin's approach to magic is fundamentally different from the other three houses. It is instrumental rather than principled, which means it asks not what should I do, but what works. And the answers it arrives at are frequently more effective than those produced by houses that filter every decision through a set of values that constrain the option space. Severus Snape is the clearest example of what Slytherin produces at its most complex and most powerful. A wizard of extraordinary ability, operating as a double agent inside the most dangerous organization in the wizarding world, sustaining a deception across decades against a legilimens of Voldemort's capability, making decisions of extraordinary consequence with incomplete information under conditions of constant existential threat. This is Slytherin resourcefulness and cunning at their absolute ceiling. The capacity to operate inside a system you are trying to destroy, using the system's own logic against it, maintaining the performance required for survival, while serving a purpose the performance was designed to conceal. But Snape is also the example of what Slytherin's approach costs at the personal level. The complete subordination of self to strategy, the decades of isolation, the inability to exist in any relationship that wasn't filtered through the requirements of the double game. The house that produces the most effective operators also produces people for whom effectiveness has become the only available mode of being. And at the institutional level, Slytherin's most significant limitation is the one that its greatest strength creates. The house selects for people who understand systems, who can read power structures, identify leverage points, build the alliances that produce outcomes. What it does not reliably select for, what its culture does not consistently develop, is the judgment about what those systems should be used for. Slytherin produces extraordinary means and is frequently silent on ends. The ambition is cultivated. The question of what the ambition is in service of is left, largely, to the individual. This produces, across centuries of Slytherin alumni, an enormous range of outcomes. The most effective administrators in wizarding government history, alongside the architects of the most destructive dark movement Britain has seen. The same house, the same skills, the same fundamental orientation toward power, applied, in one case, toward the functioning of a society, and in the other, toward its destruction. Raw power? Slytherin has it in abundance. The house's alumni list in positions of institutional influence is unmatched by any other house across the documented history of the wizarding world. But power that cannot reliably direct itself, that produces its most catastrophic failures from its own most characteristic strength, is not the most powerful kind. It is the most dangerous kind, which is a different category. Part 3. Ravenclaw, the house that knows everything except when to use it. Ravenclaw is the house that the power conversation most consistently underestimates, and the underestimation is itself informative. The house doesn't produce the most famous battle heroes, doesn't appear at the top of the ministry's senior positions with the frequency that Slytherin does, doesn't have the cultural narrative weight that Gryffindor carries through its association with the wizarding world's most dramatic moments. Ravenclaw exists in the popular imagination as the house of academic excellence, the place where the best students go, where intellectual achievement is valued, where the witches and wizards who care more about understanding magic than performing it find their people. This framing is accurate and almost entirely misses the point. What Ravenclaw actually produces, what 7 years inside a culture built around the primacy of knowledge and the question as the highest form of intelligence creates in a developing witch or wizard, is something considerably more powerful than academic excellence. It produces people who understand the theoretical foundations of magic at a depth that the other houses do not systematically develop. And theoretical understanding of magic, at sufficient depth, translates into practical capability that exceeds what talent plus training alone can produce. Hermione Granger was sorted into Gryffindor, but her approach to magic, the systematic, theoretically grounded, exhaustively researched methodology she brought to every magical problem, is structurally Ravenclaw. And it is this approach, more than raw talent, that makes her the most consistently effective magical practitioner of her generation. Harry is more powerful in crisis. Hermione is more reliably effective across the full range of magical situations, because her understanding of why spells work means she can adapt them, modify them, apply them in situations the original caster never intended. Filius Flitwick, Charms Master, Ravenclaw Head of House, is one of the most technically accomplished wizards in the school. The magical defenses of Hogwarts, which held against Voldemort's forces long enough for the Battle of Hogwarts to be winnable, were largely his work. Not dramatic, not visible in the way that a duel or a charge or a sacrifice is visible. Structural, the kind of magical capability that operates in advance of the crisis and shapes the conditions of the crisis before it arrives. Luna Lovegood, Sorted Ravenclaw, operating at the furthest edge of the house's characteristic orientation toward unconventional thinking, is one of the most genuinely original magical minds shown across 7 years of the series. Her willingness to consider possibilities that the established magical framework excludes is not eccentricity. It is the Ravenclaw disposition taken to its logical limit, a mind so committed to following the question wherever it leads that it has stopped respecting the categories that the question is supposed to stay inside. So why is Ravenclaw not at the top of this ranking? Because knowledge without the disposition to act on it at the decisive moment produces a specific and documentable failure pattern. Ravenclaw's relationship with action is mediated, filtered through analysis, through the instinct to understand before committing, through the intellectual's characteristic preference for getting it right over getting it done. In the specific high-pressure situations where the wizarding world's most consequential decisions have been made, this mediation produces delay. And delay, in war, in crisis, in the moment when the course of things is determined by what happens in the next 30 seconds, is its own kind of failure. Ravenclaw knows the most. Knowledge is power only when it arrives in time. Part 4. Hufflepuff the house that was never playing the game you thought you were watching. Here is the argument for Hufflepuff that nobody makes and everyone should. Across both wizarding wars, the first war against Voldemort, which ran roughly from 1970 to 1981, and the second, which culminated at the Battle of Hogwarts in 1998, Hufflepuff House produced no significant Death Eaters. Not few. None. In a school where the sorting distributes students across 4 houses in roughly equal proportion, where the other 3 houses all contributed members to the most destructive dark organization in British wizarding history, Hufflepuff produced 0. This is not a small data point. This is an extraordinary one. And the wizarding world's habit of treating it as evidence that Hufflepuff is the safe, boring, unambitious house, rather than as evidence of something structurally remarkable about what Hufflepuff's values actually produce. This habit is the single most significant misreading in the standard analysis of house power. Loyalty, patience, fair-mindedness, and the willingness to do the unglamorous work are not secondary virtues. They are, it turns out, the virtues most resistant to the specific recruitment strategy that Voldemort used to build his movement. The Death Eater pipeline ran through ambition, through the promise of power, status, and the particular appeal of being on the winning side of a coming transformation. It ran through the kind of people who calculated that alignment with the rising dark power was the most efficient path to what they wanted. It ran, in other words, through the specific vulnerabilities of the other 3 houses. Slytherin's instrumental relationship with power, Gryffindor's susceptibility to the appeal of being on the important side of a significant conflict, Ravenclaw's capacity to construct intellectual frameworks that justify almost anything. Hufflepuff's values are structurally nearly immune to this pipeline. You cannot recruit a Hufflepuff with the promise of power because Hufflepuffs are not organized around the pursuit of power. You cannot recruit them with the promise of being on the winning side because their loyalty is not to outcomes, it is to people. You cannot recruit them with a sophisticated ideological argument because the fair-mindedness that Hufflepuff selects for is specifically resistant to arguments that require you to treat some people as less valuable than others. And in the Battle of Hogwarts, the final, determining confrontation of the Second War, Hufflepuff sent more students back to fight than any house except Gryffindor, including all the students who had been told to evacuate, including the ones who had no particular destiny, no prophecy, no special connection to the stakes of the confrontation. They came back because the people they were loyal to were staying, and loyalty to people is, when the test arrives, a more durable motivator than loyalty to outcomes. Cedric Diggory, Hufflepuff, Triwizard Champion, the first death of the Second War, is the clearest single example of what the house produces. Not the most powerful wizard of his age, not a strategist, not a political operator, not a crisis specialist. A person of extraordinary personal integrity, genuine fairness, and the specific kind of courage that is not the Gryffindor charge, but the quieter, more sustained kind. The courage to be decent when decency is inconvenient, to be fair when fairness costs something, to maintain your values when the situation offers you a reasonable excuse to abandon them. This is not flashy power. It does not produce the most dramatic alumni roster or the most visible institutional influence or the most impressive individual magical achievements. It produces something that the other three houses, across 2 wars and 1,000 years of wizarding history, have consistently failed to produce at scale. People who cannot be turned. Part 5. The ranking and why the answer was never about magic. Here is the ranking. Built from evidence, not sentiment. 4th, Gryffindor. Not because its members lack power, they don't. Not because courage is not a genuine and extraordinary quality. It is. 4th, because the house's most characteristic strength is also its most consistent strategic liability. Gryffindor produces people who are magnificent in the moment of confrontation and repeatedly outmaneuvered in everything surrounding it. Both wizarding wars were won, in their final moments, by Gryffindor courage. Both wizarding wars were nearly lost, in their long middles, by Gryffindor's systematic underinvestment in the institutional and strategic dimensions of conflict. A house that wins battles and loses ground is not the most powerful house. It is the most dramatic one. These are not the same. 3rd, Ravenclaw. The house with the deepest theoretical understanding of magic, the most original thinkers, the most consistent capacity to solve problems that the other houses cannot solve. 3rd, because knowledge without action is a library rather than a force. Ravenclaw's characteristic hesitation, the instinct to understand before committing, to refine before acting, to get it right before getting it done, is the thing that makes its members extraordinary in the long work of magical development and limited in the decisive moment when the long work must be spent. The house knows more than any other. Knowing is necessary and insufficient. 2nd, Slytherin. The house of institutional power, of strategic intelligence, of the longest memory, and the most sophisticated understanding of how systems work and how to move within them. 2nd, because all of this, the centuries of ministers for magic, the unmatched record of institutional influence, the genuine strategic genius that the house cultivates in its best members, produced Voldemort. This is not incidental. This is the house's own philosophy taken to its limit by the person who understood it most completely and applied it without the constraints that the other houses would have imposed. A house whose greatest strength contains, without reliable correction, the mechanism of its own most catastrophic failure is not the most powerful house. It is the most consequential one. Again, not the same category. 1st, Hufflepuff. This is the answer you didn't see coming. And the reason it is the answer is precisely why you didn't see it coming. Because Hufflepuff's power does not announce itself, does not produce the visible signatures of power that the wizarding world has been trained to recognize, does not operate through the mechanisms that the other houses compete on. Hufflepuff produced no Death Eaters. Across 2 wars, through every recruitment strategy that the darkest wizard in a century deployed, through every appeal to ambition and power and the promise of transformation, 0. This is not luck. This is the house's values functioning exactly as Helga Hufflepuff designed them to function 1,000 years ago, when she looked at what her 3 colleagues were selecting for and understood something they didn't. Power that can be corrupted is not the most powerful kind. Power that can be turned, that can be recruited, redirected, weaponized against the values that produced it, contains within itself its own ceiling. And the history of the wizarding world is, at its core, the history of power being turned. Slytherin's institutional influence turned against the ministry. Gryffindor's courage recruited into causes that courage alone cannot evaluate. Ravenclaw's knowledge constructed into frameworks that justify the unjustifiable. Hufflepuff's loyalty cannot be turned. Its fairness cannot be recruited. Its patience cannot be exploited by the promise of faster results through darker methods. The house's values are structurally resistant to the mechanisms that unmake every other kind of power. This is not weakness dressed up as strength. This is the most sophisticated understanding of power in the entire founding philosophy of Hogwarts. The understanding that the most durable power is not the most dramatic, not the most visible, not the most immediately impressive. It is the kind that holds. When everything else has been corrupted, recruited, turned, or simply exhausted by the long middle of a conflict, the kind that holds is the kind that wins. Helga Hufflepuff knew this. She built a house around it. And 1,000 years later, when the final accounting of 2 wizarding wars is made honestly, when the roster of who stayed, who returned, who could not be turned, who was there at the end. The house that everyone underestimated is the one whose values, quietly and without drama, outlasted everything that was supposed to be more powerful. The most powerful house at Hogwarts is the one that was never trying to be the most powerful house at Hogwarts. That was always the point.